In the summer of 1904, the people of Port Mercy were thinking about two things: salt and cod. Everything else could wait. The town clung to a narrow cleft in the Newfoundland coast, a scatter of wooden houses wedged between rock and water. In winter, snow and wind tried to scour it off the map. In summer, fog did the same. What kept it there at all was the yearly migration of fish across the Grand Banks. The Grand Banks were not an abstract idea to the men of Port Mercy. They were a living, shifting presence just beyond the horizon. Boys grew up hearing about them at the table: the fog, the sudden storms, the way the water went from deep blue to a strange milky green when you crossed onto the shoals. Old men liked to say that the cod lay there so thick you could walk across their backs without getting your boots wet. No one believed that, not really, but everyone wanted to. The town's entire wealth consisted of a handful of schooners, a cliff full of drying flakes and calloused hands. In 1904, the Port Mercy fleet included 4 working vessels. There was the Kestrel, tidy and well kept, her hull recently refastened, her sails patched but sound. She was captained by Thomas Hargreaves, a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s whose beard showed more gray than he liked. Hargreaves had earned a reputation as a man who brought his crew back alive and his hold back full. He was not the most beloved captain in the outports. He could be hard, and his temper was quick when a man got sloppy, but he was respected. The Kestrel had never failed to return to her harbor. There was the St. Nicholas, under Alan Doyle, a younger captain with more swagger than caution. Doyle knew how to get the last sailcloth worth of speed out of a shifting wind. He liked to talk about being first back to St. John's with a full load, beating the big harbor fleets at their own game. His crew trusted his instincts, even when those instincts made older captains shake their heads. The Marigold rode lower in the water, her frames heavy with years of repairs. Her captain, James McInnes, spoke little and listened much. Other skippers said McInnes had a nose for water. He could smell a change in the sea before the glass touched it. He believed that the banks had moods, and that a man who ignored them did not deserve a second chance. Last was the Harriet May, older than the others by at least 15 seasons. Some said she'd begun life as a banker out of Gloucester before changing hands half a dozen times and limping her way to Newfoundland. Her captain, Ephraim Pike, had been fishing those waters since before some of his crew were born. His eyesight was not what it had been, and his mates quietly did more of the real watching, but he still knew every line in his ship's planking by feel. He claimed that the Harriet talked to him at night through the creak of her timbers. The town also had the men. We know the names because of the lists kept in St. John's, and because of the way the priest at Port Mercy, Father Seamus O'Rourke, insisted on writing them down in his little parish book before each season. He said that if the sea meant to take any of them, he wanted their names written in ink somewhere on land. From those records we can say that in May of 1904, Port Mercy sent just over 40 men out onto the banks. Teenagers with salt-burned faces alongside men whose hands had twisted into permanent hooks from years of hauling line. They had names like Scanlon, Marsh, Pike, Doyle, Carney, McIver, and O'Toole. One of the youngest was Daniel Hargreaves, 16, son of Captain Thomas. Daniel had done short trips before, a few days here and there, but this was his first full season. His mother, Mary, had no illusions about the dangers. She had buried one child already and stitched shrouds for others. But she knew that there was no keeping a boy like Daniel off the water. He had grown up around the harbor, practicing knots before he could write his name properly, spending more time in the Kestrel's rigging than on the hill behind their house. To steady the boy, Hargreaves paired him in a dory with an older man, Eli Marsh. Eli had worked with the captain for more than a decade. Quiet, competent, and slow to anger, he was the sort you wanted in a small boat when things went wrong. The man who would later give one of the clearest accounts of what happened was the Kestrel's mate, Samuel Carney. Carney kept a private habit of note-taking in addition to the official ship's log. Those loose sheets, stained with tar and salt, turned up years later in a box of old papers and became part of the Outland file. Carney's notes from late May are mundane. He writes about gear, new trawl lines, half a keg of fresh hooks from a supplier in Harbor Grace, and about the weather, always the weather. May 27, wind sou'west stiff. Thought we'd lose main topsail twice. Tom grumbled, but she held. Mary sent down a parcel with Daniel's Sunday shirt in it, says he'll end. Ruin his only one on deck. Boy near jumped out of his boots when he saw the small Bible she tucked in. He scribbles a few lines about Father O'Rourke's blessing of the fleet. The priest sprinkled salt water on the bows of the schooners and said something in Latin that sounded, to the men, like any old words. What mattered more were his eyes. Several later remarked that when O'Rourke walked past the Harriet May, he paused just a little too long, hand resting on her rail. After the blessing, Mary Hargreaves pulled the priest aside. Carney, passing nearby with a coil of rope, heard just enough to remember years later. "Watch over them," she said. "I'll watch," Father O'Rourke answered. "The question is who watches over the water." 3 days later, at first light, the fleet slipped out. The world smelled of tar, smoke from breakfast fires, and wet rock. Seabirds mobbed the harbor mouth, shrieking at the wakes. Women and children stood in little clusters by the wharf, shawls tight, hands raised in farewell. Men waved back in the casual style of people pretending this was ordinary. Past the point, the wind freshened. The dark comb of the coastline dropped away. Ahead lay only the faint haze where the Grand Banks began. On the Kestrel's quarterdeck, Hargreaves stood with a hand on the wheel and another on the rail. Daniel perched near the mizzen, trying not to look as excited as he felt. Carney made a mark in the official log. June 9, departed Port Mercy bound Banks. Weather fair, wind NNE, moderate. He did not yet know that, 5 entries later, the script would change. The trip out took several days. The fleet sailed together at first, 4 sets of sails etched against the sky, sharing the same patches of clear water and fog. Men called across in half-heard jokes when they drifted close enough. Once, in a calm spell, the Marigold's crew passed a tobacco tin slung on a line back and forth between decks. McInnes and Hargreaves shared a rare laugh over the cheap leaf. Occasionally, porpoises paced the bows, gray backs knifing out of the swells. Carney notes them, porps surfacing on larboard. Daniel says they're the souls of drowned men visiting, told him they just want our fish. By June 12th, the water under the Kestrel had changed color. It went from deep blue to a peculiar greenish gray, not opaque, but somehow thicker. The lead line told them what their eyes suspected. They were on the banks. Fishing, there was both muscle and ritual. Before dawn each day, Hargreaves would bring the Kestrel up into the wind and call, "Dories." Men scrambled to their stations. The little boats hung along the schooner's sides, each with 2 men assigned. The mate checked that every dory carried oars, sails rolled and tied, a small keg of water, and enough bait and hooks for the shift. The names of each pair, Marsh/D. Hargreaves, Scanlon/Riley, and so on, went up on a slate by the companionway. On a shouted count, the block and tackle squealed and the dories went down, kissing the sea one by one. Men climbed down into them, boots finding their places from habit. The lines were let out, and the Kestrel turned slightly, taking up her position as the center of a slowly widening cluster of open boats. Seen from the deck of the schooner, the dories looked fragile and small, the heads of their crews bobbing against the swells. Seen from the dory, the Kestrel looked steady, almost immovable, a patch of home afloat on an indifferent sea. On those first days, everything went as it should. Hooks came up heavy. The cod were thick, silver backs flashing as they broke the surface. Men cursed and grinned, arms burning. The holds began to fill with the wet thud of fish. At night the decks reeked of salt blood and scales. Carney's unofficial notes from June 12th and 13th are mostly about work. A torn sail, a near miss with a trawl getting tangled in a man's leg. But 2 lines stand out. Fog moving in strips today. Odd. You can see a boat clear as a painting 1 minute, gone the next. Sound is wrong. Hear men talking where there are no boats. Joe Pike from Harriet came by in his dory to swap tobacco. Said something big, brushed his hull from below. Told him he was listening to old women's tales. He didn't laugh. Fog was no stranger here. It was the bank's most constant ally. Men lived with it, cursed it, and made their peace with it. When visibility dropped, the captains watched their compasses and clocks, calculating drift by feel and habit to keep the spread of dories from wandering too far. But the fog that came on the 13th had a different character. It lay in long bands, stripes of white that drifted across calm water as if rolled off some invisible machine. A dory could row into one and disappear from its neighbor's sight in 10 strokes, only to emerge out the other side. Voices bent around in ways that made people uneasy. More than one man reported hearing his own name in a tone he didn't quite recognize. On the Kestrel, a deckhand swore he heard his mother calling him from somewhere off the port bow. She had been dead 3 years. Carney's notes are cautious, likely echoes, tricks, men uneasy. But in the margin, in a lighter hand, he adds, or something under mouth against the surface. The first physical sign that something was wrong came not from the Kestrel, but from the St. Nicholas. On the afternoon of the 13th, with the fog thinned and the sea lying almost flat, one of Doyle's dorymen, Owen O'Malley, hauled up something he did not like the look of. It was a cod, but not as they were used to seeing them. The fish was scarred down one side in a series of puckered circles, as if a giant hand with too many fingers had grasped it and squeezed. Some marks broke the skin, leaving raw flesh exposed. Others were deep but healed, white against the speckled gray. O'Malley shouted to his dory mate, Scanlon, who shouted to another boat. The cod made its way up the chain of curiosity until it landed on the deck of the St. Nicholas. Doyle walked around it, chewing his pipe stem. "Shark," he said finally, "or squid. Something tried for him and didn't finish. You going to tell me nothing big eats on a bank like this?" His men reluctantly agreed. It was easier than imagining something that grabbed but did not bite. The cod went into the tub with the others, scars and all. Later a second fish came up marked the same way, then a third. No one liked that. On the Kestrel, Eli Marsh and Daniel pulled up their own line with an eerie gap in the middle. Every hook for 10 fathoms was bare, the bait stripped clean. Below that, the fish were still there. "Something big moving through," Eli muttered, taking a look and deciding what it wants. Daniel asked, "What does it want?" Eli shrugged and baited again. "Not us," he said, though he was less sure than he sounded. By the evening of the 13th, the wind had died almost completely. The banks turned to slate. Carney described it as sea-like worked pewter, hammered flat with only the memory of swell. It was beautiful in a way, but wrong. No one liked a sea with that few wrinkles. Water was supposed to move. From the Kestrel's rail, he peered down and saw his own reflection looking back at him, distorted but recognizable. For a breathless second, he could almost have convinced himself that he was peering through glass at some great hall, and that if he leaned far enough he could see the bottom. He did not lean. Beneath his face something else seemed to hover, not a form exactly, a darkness, a smudge deeper than the surrounding green. He blinked and it was gone. That night, as the men snored in their cramped bunks and slung hammocks, the sea made almost no sound against the Kestrel's hull. The only noises were the small, intimate ones of a working ship at rest. Rope creaking softly, wood settling, a cup rolling an inch and stopping. Around midnight, Carney woke with the unshakable feeling that someone had spoken his name. There was no one near his bunk. The lamp in the companionway swung gently. The air smelled of oil and salt and old wool. He told himself he'd been dreaming and lay back down. As he drifted, he thought he heard something slide along the outside of the hull, Not a wave, not ice. A long, slow scrape, like a palm broader than the ship was long drawing itself along the planks. The kestrel did not move. None of the men woke. Only the mate lay awake in his narrow bunk, counting heartbeats until the faint sound faded. He did not write that part down until much later. Morning came as it always did, pale and unforgiving. Men rolled out, cursed, dressed, gulped down something hot from the galley. Hargreaves took his position, hands on the rail. The glass showed a steady pressure. The sky was faded, neither friendly nor hostile. "Dories," he called, and the routine unfolded. Nothing in that gray light hinted that the day would be any different from 100 other days the men of Port Mercy had spent on the banks. No horns blew, no birds fled, no sudden storm front drew a line across the distance. Yet by sunset, Port Mercy would be missing 3 boats and 6 men. If the sea does give warnings, they are often in a language we do not understand. That day, one of them may simply have been the silence. Kearney wrote in his last calm line before the chaos. June 16, air heavy. No birds all morning. Sea too smooth. Men making black jokes about being able to walk home. Tom says we take what the day gives. What the day gave them, after a few hours of ordinary work, was something no one in that little fleet had seen before. It began with a shout from the direction of the St. Nicholas. And it ended with 3 dories dragged straight down, as if the surface of the sea had been a skin that something beneath tore open with its hand. The men who later tried to describe June 16, 1904, did so in the careful language of sailors and in the halting voice of people remembering a nightmare. Years afterward, when the Marine Board questioned them, they would arrange their memories into neat answers. But in the raw accounts, the letters written home, the muttered talk in taverns, the day is muddled, overlapping, full of moments that do not quite align. From those fragments, the Outland Archives reconstructs the clearest possible sequence. The morning began like any other on the banks. Dawn bled up behind low cloud. The sea lay almost unnaturally flat, a faint swell lifting the hulls but never breaking. The light had a strange, washed quality, as if someone had rubbed chalk over the sun. On the kestrel, Captain Hargreaves came up from below, squinting at the horizon. He had slept poorly, but he did not let that show. His son Daniel was already on deck, coiling a line, trying hard not to look as if he were waiting for his father's eye. Kearney's private notes describe the boy. Full of himself and scared under it. Said he dreamed of a cod as big as the church. I told him that if he caught one, I'd retire and let him take my berth. At 4:20 a.m., dories went over the side. From above, the process looked almost choreographed. Boats eased down, men dropped into them, sails and oars stowed. The kestrel lay hove to as her smaller craft fanned away, each man knowing roughly where to go. Daniel and Eli took their place off the starboard quarter. Eli rowed the first stretch, letting the boy watch the spread of water, judge distances. "You keep the kestrel where you can see her bow and the Harriet's mizzen," Eli said. "That way you know you're in your patch. Lose sight of both and you've gone too far." They baited their first lines and dropped them, feeling the familiar tug as cod found their offerings. For a time, everything else faded into the rhythm of work. Drop, set, haul. Hands moving through the cold gray air, shoulders burning, gulls finally appearing to scream overhead as the smell of blood and offal built. Across a mile or more of water, similar scenes played out around the other schooners. Men on the Nicholas shouted jokes to each other between dories. On the Marigold, McInnis's crew worked in a quieter way, focused and efficient. On the Harriet May, Joe Pike and Harris argued half-heartedly over who would get first pull on the heaviest line. The sea held its breath. Around mid-morning, something shifted. Kearney noted it without understanding. On the kestrel's deck, he felt it through the soles of his wet boots. It was not a wave, not a roll, more like a faint sag, as if the ship had settled a fraction of an inch lower into her own reflection. At the same time, several doormen reported a sense that their boats were sitting not on water but on something thicker. The dories moved sluggishly, without any chop to justify it. Then somewhere off the Nicholas's starboard beam, a man yelled. Voices carry oddly at sea. The shout came in pieces, shredded by distance. Carney caught only the urgency, not the words. Captain Doyle of the Nicholas, closer to the trouble, reacted first. He strode to the rail, hand shading his eyes, and saw one of his boats, Scanlon and a younger man named Riley, sitting oddly low. From the kestrel, Carney raised his glass. Through the lens, the dory jumped into sudden proximity. The two men aboard were not hauling. They stood braced, both hands on a single line that vanished over the bow. Their faces were contorted with effort. The bow itself pointed not out but down, like a finger pushed at the surface. The line did not angle away from the boat toward some distant snag. It plunged straight into the sea, dead vertical. In that instant, Carney's gut told him this was not a normal foul. He had seen plenty of snags. Nets caught on old gear or on uncharted rock pulled with a kind of heavy reluctance, snagged to one side. A strong fish surged and darted, jerking a line in unpredictable bursts. This was neither. This was a sustained, implacable pull. Doyle cupped his hands and bellowed toward the struggling men. Cut your line." Scanlon's head snapped up. Even across the distance, Carney saw the hesitation. Every hook and yard of line represented days of work and precious coin. Men did not cut gear lightly. Riley shouted something, maybe agreement, maybe fear. Together they lunged for the coil. The line answered by snapping tighter. It moved so fast it blurred. It ripped the coil from Riley's grip, lashed against the thwart and dug into the bow. The dory jerked forward a yard, its nose plunging. Water spilled over the gunwale. One of the men, Riley, lost his footing and crashed to his knees, hands flailing. Scanlon grabbed the line again and was nearly pulled overboard. He let go in time, but not fast enough to avoid deep burns across his palms. From Carney's view, the scene seemed almost slow, unreal. He watched the little boat pivot around that single, maddened rope. "Christ," he muttered, "it's got them by the chin." Doyle's voice cracked across the water. "Cut, you damned fool." Scanlon snatched at his belt knife. For a heartbeat, it looked like he might make it. Then the line gave a single vicious surge. The bow slammed down, the stern lifted, and in that instant the dory stopped being something that floated and became something being dragged. It did not capsize, not then. It went nose first into the sea. The men aboard shouted, but their words broke off as the boat's own motion threw them forward. For a second, the stern stood almost upright, freed of its usual relationship with the horizon. Then, with a smoothness that made several onlookers want to vomit, the entire dory slid beneath the surface as if falling through a hole. The water boiled for a moment. Scanlon surfaced, coughing, his cap gone, his hair slick against his head. He tried to swim after something. The end of the line, the vanished dory. He did not seem to know. Riley came up in a different place, closer to the Nicholas, arms thrashing. Lines flew from neighboring dories. Men shouted instructions that made no difference to anything. From the kestrel it looked almost manageable, terrible but familiar. Men lost their boats. They were hauled out of the water if the sea allowed. Then something took Scanlon again. One moment he was there, arm raised, palm outstretched toward a rope. The next he was gone, yanked under by a force that did not foam or swirl or leave any trace but a brief, sucker punch hole where he had been. A man on the Marigold later said, "It was like a child snatching a toy off the surface of a pond. Only the child was under the pond, and the toy weighed 200 pounds. Riley survived. He got a hand on a line and was pulled, half drowned, into another boat. He coughed up water and fragments of a scream. When he could talk, all he said for a long time was, "It's still down there. It's still holding on." Back on the Kestrel, Hargreaves wasted no time. He ordered his nearest dories to pull in their gear and close up around the ship. He had no intention of letting his small boats drift across whatever invisible tangle had just taken the Nicholases. There was shouting, confusion, the thud of boots on deck. In the middle of that, out beyond their cluster, the day went on. Lines dropped, fish bit or did not, haze shifted, other ships made their own choices. On the Harriet May, Captain Pike hesitated. His men had seen the Nicholas incident at a distance. A strange commotion, a boat vanishing, men hauled aboard. The details blurred with distance and speculation. Pike balanced two sets of instincts. The first was the old fear born of a lifetime on those waters. The second was the inexorable pressure of need. His ship was under-provisioned. His owners in St. John's were not patient men. The Harriet May's share of the bank would not catch itself. In the end, hunger won. He ordered his dories out again, with strict warnings. Anything pulls like that, you don't argue. You cut and curse and row like hell. No fish is worth a coffin. His nephew, Joe, nodded hard enough to make his cap slip. As Joe and Harris worked their lines in their small ring of sea, ordinary life tried to reassert itself. On the Kestrel, O'Toole made a coarse joke about the size of the fish that must be eating the Nicholas's gear. Men laughed too loudly. The laugh snapped when Kearney reminded them of Scanlan's drowned face. Daniel Hargreaves and Eli reset their trawl with more care than before. Both men eyed the angle of their line as if waiting for it to betray them. For a time, nothing happened. Then Daniel felt a peculiar lightness where he expected weight. He hauled hand over hand, expecting to see the familiar drag of fish. Instead, the line came up in smooth, taut lengths. The hooks, when they broke the surface, were bare and straight. He stared. "Something has been up and down this like a man picking apples," Eli said quietly. They rebaited, dropped again. This time, they did not have long to wait. The first sign was a faint vibration under the soles of their boots. It was subtle, a hum through the planks that did not correspond to any normal motion of hull or water. Daniel glanced at Eli, eyes wide. "Feel that?" he asked. Eli opened his mouth to answer. The coil of spare line in the stern moved. Slowly at first, then with a sudden whip, it uncoiled like a living thing and slid toward the gunwale. One end vanished over the side. The rest followed, yanked as if a giant had seized it from below. The loose loops wrapped themselves around Eli's leg and one of the thwarts. There was no time for elegance. Eli swore and grabbed for the rope, fingers digging in, trying to drag it back. Daniel joined him. The line burned their palms, hot despite the cold water. "Cut it," Eli gasped. "Cut." "Dan." Eel reached for his knife. The blade flashed in his numb hand. The line surged. Later, men would argue about whether the surge came from above or below. From where Daniel stood, it felt as if the floor of the world had dropped away. The stern of the dory dipped. Water slapped over the edge. The bow rose, nose lifting, throwing them both backward. Daniel fell across the thwart, knife skidding from his grip. Eli lost his footing entirely. The loop around his ankle bit tight. Kearney, squinting from the Kestrel's deck, saw his captain's son stand suddenly upright in a boat that no longer moved as a boat should. He shouted to no one in particular. "He's got him by the leg." Hargreaves heard. He leaned over the rail. For a moment, father and son looked at each other across 50 yards of empty, treacherous water. No one knows what passed between their eyes. The dory tipped further. 1 second its stern still rode on the surface. The next it was almost vertical. The sea seemed to open a dark mouth to take it. Daniel caught a glimpse of something under the waterline, a broad, pale shape, the size of the dory and more, sliding along under them like a ghost. It had no discernible head, no limbs, just an immense sense of bulk. His mind did what all minds do when presented with something they cannot parse. It grabbed for the closest available image. Whale, he thought, even as some deeper part of him knew this was wrong. Whales came up. Whales breathed. Whatever this was, it seemed to own the down. Eli did not have even that. The line snapped tight around his ankle, wrenched, and he was gone. One instant he was there, face twisted in effort, hands tearing at the rope. The next, the rope took him over the side and down, leaving only churned water and an echo of his curse. Daniel screamed. The sound cut through the unnatural calm, sharper than any gull's cry. Men on the Kestrel, the Marigold, and the Nicholas all heard it. Years later, some would say they woke at night hearing that note again. Daniel grabbed for the spare end of the line, trying to get a purchase, to pull his dory back to some semblance of normal. The rope moved through his hands like a snake. It burned stripes into his palms and then was gone. The last of it whipped over the bow and vanished into the same impossible depth. For half a heartbeat the dory hung there, half full of water, freed of its tether. Daniel staggered to his feet, knife lost, heart pounding so loud it drowned every other sound. He never made it to the gunwale. The second line in the boat, a different trawl, one they had not yet set, went tight. It had been lying in a neat coil, its end tucked safe. Now that end slithered like a live thing, looping around the base of the forward thwart and disappearing over the side. The boat jerked again, this time forward. Daniel pitched onto his hands and knees. He had time to think one coherent thought, not like this. On the Kestrel's deck, his father watched his son small, hunched back, and the way his arms flailed as he scrabbled for a hold. "Cut it," Hargreaves bellowed, voice shredding. "Cut, cut." There was nothing left to cut. The line sang, vibrating through the dory's very bones. Then the boat, like Scanlan's before it, went down. Waves do not behave that way. When a vessel founders in a storm, it rolls, fills, beats against the water. There is a chaos to it, a mess of boards and foam and terrible time. This was surgical. One heartbeat, a shabby dory floated in an unnatural calm. The next, something under the surface yanked, and it was as if the sea swallowed it in one hard convulsion. A column of bubbles rose, turned to froth, then smoothed. Hargreaves gripped the rail so hard the knuckles showed through his skin. He did not register the pain. Somewhere beyond thought, he knew Daniel was not in the boat anymore. That did not stop him from shouting his name until his throat tore. The sea gave him that much. Daniel came up again. He broke the surface not far from the Kestrel, arms flailing, chest heaving. His hair slicked over his eyes. His face was a mask of disbelief and furious will. The crew roared at him, at each other. "Line, line!" A coil flew out and landed within an arm's length of him. He lunged, fingers brushing the wet hemp. In that half-second, every man on the Kestrel believed they had him. Then the water under Daniel's chest dropped. There was no swirl, no sudden wave, just a clean, invisible pluck. His head snapped back. His body jerked straight as if someone had seized his ankles. His eyes met his father's across the shrinking distance. And he went straight down. Not away at an angle, not dragged along, down. It was so fast that Hargreaves, in later nightmares, remembered it as a cut in a strip of film. One frame his son was there, desperate and trying. In the next, there was nothing but a small hollow in the water and the frayed end of something brushing the surface. The sea. Rel hauled the line in anyway, their hands moving by reflex long after their minds had checked out. They pulled in nothing. On the Marigold, McInnes watched the scene through a spyglass he wished he had never picked up. The lenses brought human despair close enough to touch. When he lowered the glass, he found that his own hands were shaking. It went under him like a trapdoor giving way. he said later. If it had been a net or a wreck or a whale, there would have been signs. There were none, just that straight-down taking. While attention focused on the Kestrel's disaster, another line of trouble was moving under the Harriet May. Joe Pike and Harris had heard the shouts. They could see, in a distant, confusing way, dories rising and falling, men crowding the Kestrel's rails. Pike, who had grown up in a house where only bad news traveled fast, knew that much. "We're pulling in," he said. "If they're going home, I'm going home." Harris nodded, relief washing through him. They began hauling their own gear, wanting no loose lines that might decide to misbehave. They did not get far. Their main trawl came up with an odd resistance, not heavy exactly but inconsistent. Hooks alternated between full and empty. Then midway there was a sudden nothingness, a length of bare line with every bait gone, no nicks, no tears. "Something came along and licked it clean," Harris muttered. Below that gap, the cod were on again. Pike's nerves jangled. "Leave it," he said. "We've enough for one day. I don't like this water." They cut the lower section of the trawl, sacrificing bait and hooks, and turned their dory toward the Harriet May. As they did, the unnatural calm deepened. Wind died entirely. Sails sagged. The sound of the other ships seemed to thin, as if they were further away than they should have been. In that suspended moment, a wake formed in the water between their dory and the Harriet May. It had no visible cause. No boat cut it. No beast surfaced. It was simply a V-shaped line of disturbed water, darker than the rest, rushing toward the schooner's hull. Joe Pike saw it and shouted. Harris, turning, felt a tremor run up through his oar. The V struck the Harriet May's side. The old schooner shuddered. Every man aboard felt the impact in his teeth. The hull groaned like a living thing. Crockery rattled. A barrel rolled, hit the bulwark, and bounced back. Then horribly the ship leaned. Not in a gentle roll, not with the usual rhythm of swell. She went over on her starboard side as if pushed by an invisible hand. The deck canted. Men grabbed at stays and rails. One lost his footing and slammed into a hatch combing. Another slid into the scuppers, boots skidding. On the Kestrel, Hargreaves looked up from the empty sea where his son had been, and saw the Harriet May listing in a way no captain wants to see any ship list. He swore, a hoarse, cracked sound, and waved frantically, as if his arm could hold the older vessel upright. "What now?" someone whispered. On the Harriet May, Captain Pike barked orders. "Axes, cut every damn thing you've got down there. Get us free." The crew scrambled. Lines snaked across the deck, taut as iron rods. Some went to the nets, others to the trawls. One, thicker and set deeper, seemed to run straight down through the planking itself. The men hacked at anything they could reach. Nets fell away. Floats bobbed to the surface. Fishermen winced as investments worth more than their yearly pay hit the water and drifted uselessly. None of that mattered compared to the feel of the hull under their boots. The pull did not let up. Beneath them, unseen, something held on. Pike dropped to his knees near the mainmast and placed his palm flat against the planks. He later struggled to describe what he felt. "It was like standing on a bridge while a wagon passes under," he said. "Only the wagon was the size of a church, and it didn't care that we were standing there." The ship listed further. Water lapped at her starboard rail. Men on the high side grabbed for anything solid. Sacks of salt began to slide. A cask broke loose and went charging downhill, nearly taking a man's legs with it. For a few sickening heartbeats, every sailor who could see her thought the Harriet May was about to capsize. There was a peculiar helplessness in that vision. The sea was flat, the sky mild, and yet an old ship might still roll and drown in sight of her sisters, under a sun that shone like any other. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the strain ceased. No slow easing, no gradual relief. The tension snapped and the Harriet May jerked upright. The force of that return knocked two men off their feet and flung one clean over the port rail into the water. Another slammed his head against the pump and went limp. Pike heard distantly the crack of a timber somewhere deep below. He would find the scar later, a long, gouged groove along the keelson, as if something hard and rough had rubbed against it with enormous pressure. The line that had seemed to disappear into the very keel surfaced in a lazy coil, drifting with no more menace than a piece of old twine. It should have been slack, it should have stayed where it was. Instead it moved. Not with any natural swell, but with a slow, deliberate slither, like a snake testing the air. Harris, in the dory not 20 yards away, saw the upper part of that rope bulge, as if something invisible still gripped the far end. The sensation that something under the Harriet May was thinking about its next move was almost worse than the violence. He and Joe rowed for the schooner with a frenzy born of more than fear of weather. By late afternoon, the bank felt like a place that had exhaled and was waiting to see what would happen next. The captains conferred across the distance as best they could, shouting, signaling. Doyle of the Nicholas wanted to stay. He argued that they had already lost more than they could afford. They had to make it back somehow. The fish were still there. The day was calm. If they kept their wits and cut fast, they might manage. McInnes, watching the pattern of glassy patches on the water, shook his head. "We've seen too much," he told his mate. "Fish aren't worth it when the sea is trying new tricks." Hargreaves, raw from the loss of his son, said little. His decision was already made. "I'm not dangling another man over that hole," he muttered. "If the owners do like it, they can come out here and argue with whatever lives under us." Pike, hands still on the Harriet May's rail where he could feel every creak of her bones, came around slowly. He looked at the gouge at his feet, at the slack line lying like a dead snake on the boards, at the place where one of his men had gone into the water and not come back up. In the end, hunger lost. He ordered his gear aboard. The Nicholas stayed on the ground a little longer, against McInnes's shouted warning. Doyle took one more haul of fish before his nerve broke. His crew never forgave him for that extra hour. None of them lost another boat that day. That small counting felt like mercy. Even as the fleet turned and made for home, sails filling with the first decent breeze of the day, something moved behind them. Kearney wrote of it in the smallest script in his notes, as if reluctant to give it full size. After everything saw a rise astern. As we stood off looking back, the water where we'd been lay still as a mirror except for one swelling. Not a wave, not a whale, a back, broad, rounded, no fin, no tail in sight, came up slow as if testing the air, did not breathe, simply showed itself and sank. Skin looked like wet stone, darker than the water but not black, too big, too damned big. He did not call Captain Hargreaves to see it. He kept that one to himself. Perhaps he thought the man had suffered enough. The Kestrel, the Marigold, the Harriet May, and the Nicholas all turned their bows toward Port Mercy that evening. Their holds were not full, but they were not empty either. A man who knew nothing of what lay beneath might have called it a marginally bad trip. For those who stood on the decks and stared back at the glassy patch of sea where 3 dories had gone down, the numbers meant nothing. Something had pulled back against their hooks. It knew now what hung from those lines. The question that would haunt them for years was not just what they had hooked. It was whether, on that day, they had finally convinced something in the cold dark that the surface world was worth reaching for. When the Port Mercy fleet came home, they did not come in together. The Harriet May limped in first, 3 days behind schedule, her sails patched on the run and her deck crew moving like old men. She had taken damage that no one on shore could immediately see, but that every man aboard felt through his boots. Her keel had a new complaint in it, a subtle twist that made her creak on even the gentlest swell. The Marigold followed a day later, Then the St. Nicholas and the Kestrel, that last ship sliding into the harbor at dusk under a sky the color of lead. The people of Port Mercy did what they always did when the fleet came back. They counted boats. They counted dories. They counted faces as men pulled off wool caps and waved. The counting did not add up. Father O'Rourke was standing on the wharf with Mary Hargreaves when the Kestrel rounded the headland. He saw her face change before he fully understood why. "They're dories," she whispered. "Tom's missing one." She had watched that ship leave the harbor countless times. She knew how many boats should hang along each rail. There was a gap on the starboard side, a space where Daniel's and Eli's dory should have been. Hargreaves stood on the quarterdeck like a carved figurehead, one hand on the rail, the other hanging at his side, knuckles white. He did not look toward the town until the Kestrel's anchor splashed down and the sails began their tired fall. Even then, he could not quite bring his eyes to meet his wife's. The first sound on the wharf was not wailing. It was silence, dense and waiting. People scanned the crowded deck, ticking off the faces they recognized. The names of the missing formed in their minds before they were spoken aloud. Scanlon, Riley's mate, Eli Marsh, Daniel Hargreaves, two more men from Pike's crew whose families had expected them back with the same unspoken assumption that had carried every other season. Of course they will return. The sea takes some, but not mine, not this time. When the understanding finally broke the surface, it did so in individual cries. A woman near the end of the wharf let out a sound like someone tearing cloth. A child started wailing without knowing exactly why, only that all the grown-ups had gone wrong. Mary did not cry at first. She stood very straight, chin up, fingers digging into the worn wood of the railing. When Hargreaves came down the gangplank, she stepped forward with a terrible steadiness. "Where is he?" she asked. No preamble, no attempt to soften the question. Hargreaves's throat worked. The words he had rehearsed on the trip back, the ones about God's will and the way of the sea, died somewhere between his chest and his tongue. In the end, he could only shake his head. "He went down, Mary." How? The word was flat. "The line took him." It was not a full answer, not yet, but it was the only one he could manage with his boots still on the planks that had brought him home when they had refused his son. Behind them, the harbor filled with the noise of men disembarking, gear being thrown to shore, the muted clank of iron. Father O'Rourke stayed where he was. His job, for the moment, was to be a fixed point in a place where too many things were shifting. By the end of that first evening, the town had the bare bones of the story. Boats taken, lines dragging down in flat calm, men yanked under as if trapdoors had opened under them. The Harriet May staggered by something that had pulled on her from below hard enough to make her rail kiss the sea. The details varied, but the structure, the idea that something in the water had pulled back, was constant. For a fishing community, that notion was more than just frightening. It was an inversion of the natural order. Men were used to lowering lines, to feeling the small, sudden shock of a fish's life at the end. They were used to hauling, to deciding how much force to apply. The idea that something unseen could grab the other end and haul them was like the earth suddenly trying to swap places with the sky. In the days that followed, grief and practicality jostled for space. Widows needed to be told. Some already knew from the moment the sails crested the point. Others had held onto small hopes, only to have them wrenched away one by one. Mary buried her face in her hands exactly once in public, then straightened and went about the business of feeding the men who had come back. Her kitchen became a kind of unofficial debriefing room. Sailors sat at her table, cradling mugs of hot tea with hands still swollen from the salt, and tried to explain the inexplicable. Riley, the survivor from Scanlon's dory, came to her house on the third evening, hat twisting in his fists. "I should have kept hold of him," he said, voice choked. "If I'd had one more second." Mary looked at his bandaged wrists. the deep raw grooves where the rope had burned into his skin. "You did what there was to do," she said quietly. "The rest wasn't yours." Vath. Uruk heard confessions that week, which no seminary had prepared him for. Men spoke not just of fear, but of the sliver of awe they had felt when the sea had shown them a hint of its size. Some admitted that a small, traitorous part of them had wanted to see more, even as other parts had screamed to get away. "It was wrong, Father," one man said, "but it was beautiful too, in the same way a cliff is beautiful when you're looking over the edge and thinking about falling." Uruk did not have a liturgical category for that. He gave penances anyway. He recommended generous offerings for the families of the dead and long, hard work on safer water. Word spread along the coast faster than any schooner. By the time the formal report from Port Mercy reached St. John's, rumors of something under the banks had already reached taverns and fish sheds throughout the island. In some versions, the creature had tentacles. In others, it was a snake, a living piece of rope returned to claim its kin. In more than one telling, the numbers grew: 4 boats, 6, a whole fleet dragged under by a giant invisible hand. Shipping companies disliked rumors about supernatural hazards on profitable grounds. Boards of inquiry did not exist to chase monsters. Their mandate was safety, insurance, and assignable blame. Nevertheless, in early July 1904, the Marine Board convened a hearing under case number MBI 1900-427, titled in clinical script, "Loss of certain boats and lives from vessels Kestrel, St. Nicholas, Harriet May, Port Mercy Fleet on or about June 16, 1904, Grand Banks region." The hearing took place in a stuffy room in St. John's, with charts pinned to walls and a large table in the center crowded with ledgers, a barometer, and a model dory someone had dragged in to demonstrate how easily such a thing could be overturned. Most of the fishermen had never seen so much polished wood indoors in their lives. Hargreaves sat at one end, stiff as a mast. McInnes and Pike flanked him. Doyle of the Nicholas lounged with a show of careless ease that fooled no one. On the other side of the table sat men in uniforms and suits. Commander Arthur Fleming of the Royal Navy, detailed as an expert in marine operations. Mr. Blake, a representative for one of the major shipping concerns. A clerk with ink-stained fingers and the hunched posture of a man already thinking about how many copies of the transcript he would have to make. The atmosphere was not hostile, it was worse. It was politely skeptical. Fleming opened the proceedings with the usual questions: course, weather, gear, known hazards. The captains answered in the practiced tones of seamen who have had to justify their decisions before. Yes, the weather had been unusual in its calm. No, there had been no swell or storm present. Yes, there had been fog the day before, but visibility was clear on the 16th. Their positions, roughly established by dead reckoning, were marked on the chart with small X marks in blue pencil. "So you were here," Fleming said, tapping the paper. "Depth 60 fathoms, give or take." "By the lead, yes," McInnes replied. "Any known wrecks in that spot? Old gear, cables?" "None we've ever tangled with," Hargreaves said. The board members looked at one another with expressions that said, "That doesn't mean they aren't there." Then came the harder part. Each surviving crewman from the lost dories was called in turn. Riley, hands still healing, spoke of the line going taut and of Scanlon being jerked forward as if some enormous hand had taken hold of their gear on the bottom of the world. Joe Pike, hat twisting, described the V-shaped disturbance racing toward the Harriet May, and the way the schooner had leaned, groaned, and tried to roll even though the surrounding water barely stirred. The board's questions focused on angles and tensions. "Is it possible," one man asked, "that a sudden movement of your own vessel caused the line to catch and pull your dory off balance?" Riley stared at him. "Sir, the Nicholas was barely moving. There was no sea to speak of. If she'd pitched, I'd have felt it in my knees. This came from under us. Could you have been snagged on some old anchor, a piece of cable? What cable runs out in 60 fathoms on a bank? Riley shot back, then flushed, realizing he'd just spoken sharply to someone with far more stripes than he had. Commander Fleming raised a hand to quiet both witness and fellow examiner. "Let's talk about the character of the pull," he said. "You have all used the words straight down. Tell me what you mean by that. How did it differ from, say, the drag of a heavy cod catch?" There was a shuffling of feet. Sailors are not used to putting the feel of a line into words. They simply know. "It didn't play," Hargreaves said finally. "A fish will give you something. A jerk, a surge, you haul, it fights. This was like somebody set a winch below us and turned it. No give, no change. It would have pulled until the rope broke or the boat went under. That is not unknown when men snag on wreckage," one of the owner's representatives pointed out. "No, sir," McInnes agreed. "What is unknown is wreckage that moves from one ship to the next in a morning, grabbing 3 different boats in 3 different places." Silence again. Fleming scribbled something in his notes that his later, sanitized summary would not include. At one point, an older sailor named Harris, Joe Pike's mate, leaned forward and spoke in a low voice that carried farther than he may have intended. "It wasn't just taking the gear," he said. "It tested it, took the bait clean on some hooks, left others, felt along the line until it found what it liked. I've pulled big fish. This didn't feel like one of God's creatures trying to swim away. It felt like something that had never seen a rope before getting to know what one was." That sentence made it into exactly one place, a margin note in Commander Fleming's personal copy of the transcript, followed by a single question mark. No one wrote it into the official record. The board was not completely blind to what it heard. Fleming, for one, had sailed long enough to know that the ocean could not be reduced to neat lines on a chart, but he also understood politics. At the end of 3 days of testimony, he retired to draft the finding. The formal conclusion, stamped and signed, avoided anything that might upset insurance underwriters. It spoke of probable fouling of fishing gear on submerged obstruction or wreckage, of insufficiently rapid severing of lines under emergency load, and of panic-induced mishandling of small craft under stress. The phrase "unknown large marine organism" did not appear anywhere. Attached to that neat report, stapled at an angle and not intended for wide circulation, was Fleming's private memorandum. The handwriting is smaller there, the tone more honest. "Off the record," he wrote, "I admit to a certain discomfort with the pat nature of our official conclusions. These men are not prone to fancies at sea. Their descriptions of a sustained, vertical pull of considerable magnitude from a position with no charted hazard give me pause. Were this the first such story I had heard, I would be more inclined to dismiss it outright. It is not. There are, scattered through our files and the oral lore of sailors, whispers of similar events, boats dragged in calm water, anchors lost from beneath steady hulls, peculiar swells in otherwise flat seas. I do not venture to name a cause. The depths under even the shallow banks are vast by human standard. That life exists there in forms little known to science is beyond doubt. That some of those forms may be capable of interacting with our gear in ways we do not yet understand seems likely. I would advise, at minimum, that the specific patch of ground described by the Port Mercy men be avoided when practical, until more thorough soundings can be made. As far as the Outland Archives can determine, those soundings were never done. Shipping companies do not love the word mystery in relation to profitable grounds. Official charts remained unchanged. Unofficial ones, however, grew a new mark. On more than one hand-drawn bank map passed between skippers over the next decade, the area where Kestrel, Nicholas, and Harriet May had had their trouble acquired a faint penciled warning, a small circle labeled simply "Bad Patch." Captains who had been there nudged younger men away from that zone with vague comments about strange sets and unlucky water. Profit and fear did their usual dance. The very richness of the surrounding region meant there was little need to press right up against the spot that made seasoned fishermen uneasy. Port Mercy itself took longer to adjust. The families of the lost had to live with the how as much as with the who. Drowning is bad enough. Drowning in flat water because something unseen decided to take you is worse. Mary Hargreaves, confronted each morning with Daniel's empty bunk and the boots that still sat by the door, did what many in her position have done. She gave herself tasks. She took in mending. She helped other widows with their accounts. She harried the owner's agents for every penny owed in compensation, not just to herself but to the other families. She argued hard enough that even the hard men in St. John's yielded more than they had intended. At night, when the house was quiet and her husband's sleep was loud with mutters and choked-off cries, she went down to the harbor. She would stand at the edge of the wharf, looking out toward the invisible line where the banks began, and talk under her breath. Not to God, she had already had her words with him. To the water, "You've had him," she would say. "You don't get to have us too." One particularly calm evening later that summer, she stood there longer than usual, the sea flat as beaten metal under a ink sky. Somewhere far offshore, a pod of whales blew, the faint exhalations reaching her like ghost sighs. Closer in, the surface barely moved. Then, just at the very limit of the harbor mouth, she saw a patch of water that failed to behave as it should. It did not ripple with a breeze or wrinkle with a passing swell. It pulsed. A soft, almost imperceptible rise and fall, as if something beneath had turned in its sleep. Mary felt every hair on her arm stand up. She did not stay to watch. Later, she would never be entirely sure whether she had actually seen anything at all, or whether grief and too many retellings had painted the sea with her fears. But from that night on, she never walked out to the end of the wharf alone again. In the years that followed, the story of the three dories spread and changed. In some tellings, the creature became a classic sea serpent, hairy and horned, coiling itself around the boats before crushing them. In others it was a malice, a spirit of drowned men who resented the living. Fishermen from other communities nodded politely when Port Mercy men spoke of their strange calm and their straight-down pulls, then countered with stories of their own. A trawler off the Scotian shelf, whose entire string of gear was yanked away from under her in the 1920s, leaving the winches spinning uselessly. A French banker that lost 3 anchors in the same small patch over a span of 5 seasons, each chain snapped off as if bitten. A Norwegian freighter whose echo-sounding line refused to give any reading at all over a particular spot in the mid-Atlantic, as if the bottom had ceased to exist there. Not all of these tales map cleanly onto the Banks incident. Some are certainly embellished. Some may be the result of equipment failure, bad seamanship, or any of the 1,001 mundane hazards that haunt deep water. But when you lay the stories beside each other, a pattern hums faintly beneath the noise. A particular quality of pull, a sense of intention without malice, or perhaps with a malice so large and slow it does not register us as something to hate, only as something to taste. Modern oceanography has given us better tools. We have sonar now, multi-beam echo sounders that can sketch the shape of the seafloor with remarkable precision. We tow cameras miles down through black water and retrieve images of animals no one knew existed a century ago. Transparent creatures that turn themselves inside out to eat, fish with teeth like needles, and eyes that glow with their own light, jellies the size of houses. We have found, in trenches deeper than the banks, giant squids with tentacles long enough to wrap a trawler's beam, and sharks older than the countries whose coasts they patrol. We like to think that because we can see more, we now know more, and to an extent that is true. But the thing about a world as wide and deep as the ocean is this: seeing more only reminds you how much remains unseen. The region the Port Mercy fishermen call the Hollow still shows up on modern charts as an area of curious bathymetry. The bottom there drops more abruptly than elsewhere, a sudden lip from shallows into deeper green. Fisheries biologists will tell you that such edges are often rich. Nutrients tumble down, upwelling currents carry plankton and small fish back toward the light. Big predators patrol these boundaries, waiting for smaller creatures to make a mistake. To a cod fisherman in 1904, that meant more hooks in more mouths. To whatever lived further down the slope, it might have meant something else entirely. Imagine, for a moment, being a creature of the deep. Not a cartoon monster, but a vast, cold-blooded thing shaped by pressure and darkness. Imagine that your world is mostly static, slow drifts of current, slow migrations of gelatinous life, the occasional thud of something large dying as it falls from above. Then, over time, a pattern begins. Above your hunting ground, threads descend, thin at first, then more numerous. At their ends hang little parcels of meat, some you ignore, some you take. Every time you pull, resistance flickers along the thread. The threads move, dance, withdraw. Sometimes bright, fast shapes dart at the edge of your awareness. They are bothersome, but they also leak more food when distressed. If you had something like curiosity, or if you were simply efficient, you might start to experiment. What if, instead of nipping at the ends of the threads, you grasp one higher up? What if you follow it to where the resistance is strongest? What if one day you pull hard? To the men in the dories, it would feel like the floor of the sea dropping out from under them. To whatever held the other end, it might feel like any other tug, scaled to its size. A bite on a line. An ache in the cold place where hunger lives. Was that in essence what brushed against Port Mercy in 1904? A slow, blind intelligence testing a new way of feeding, or R.W.E. dressing up randomness with more mind than it deserves. From the safety of a desk decades later, we have the luxury of doubt. For the people of that town, doubt took a back seat to the concrete lack of 6 chairs at 6 tables. The long shadow of that season stretched in unexpected ways. Captain Hargreaves went back to the banks the following year. Men were astonished. Some had assumed he would retire or move to safer inshore fishing. Mary knew better. Where else would he go, she said. It's what he is. On those later trips, however, other captains noticed a change. He watched his lines with an obsession that bordered on unhealthy. He was quicker to cut than before. He avoided certain patches of water even when the charts and the owners suggested better prospects there. Once, in the middle of an otherwise ordinary day, he suddenly ordered all lines hauled and sails set. The crew grumbled. The fish were biting. There was no visible change in the weather. When Kearney asked why, Hargreaves only shook his head. "Listen," he said. Kearney did. He heard the creak of timbers, the slap of minor chop against the hull, the grunt of men working. "What am I meant to be hearing?" he asked. "Nothing," Hargreaves replied, "and that's the trouble." They moved 10 miles inshore before he let them fish again. On another voyage, while sounding near the edge of the banks, they lost 2 lead weights in quick succession. The line went down, paying out in Kearney's hands. At the expected depth, where the lead should have struck bottom, the feel did not change. There was no solid, no familiar bounce. The rope kept sliding until common sense said there could not possibly be that much water under them. Then, without warning, the resistance vanished. When they hauled back, the end of the line was frayed and bare. "Bad knot," one crewman said, but there was doubt in his voice. They tied on a second weight. The same thing happened. After that, Hargreaves labeled that spot on his private chart with a single word: steep. He did not explain what he meant. Other captains, hearing about the lost sinkers, laughed it off publicly. In private, They scratched similar warnings on their own maps. No one wanted to be the next Scanlon or Daniel. What of science? In the late 20th century, a research vessel from a Canadian university ran a transect across that very region, towing long lines of sonar and other instruments. The paper they published a few years later in a marine journal was, as such things are, dry. It spoke of unusual reflectivity gradients and apparent micro-basins of unknown depth lurking under what charts had assumed were simple slopes. Between the lines, if you knew what story to look for, you could see it. In several places along their run, the sonar image showed voids. Not trenches exactly, not canyons, but abrupt columns where the machine's pulses seemed to go somewhere else. The scientists chalked it up to equipment error and moved on. Their funding did not cover mysteries that could not be monetized or easily classified. One of the technicians on that cruise, interviewed much later, remembered something stranger. At around 3 in the morning on a very still night, as the vessel drifted with most of the crew asleep, the long steel cable of their deepest tow line began to hum. Not from strain, not from wind. The sea was as close to windless as the North Atlantic ever gets. The cables, slack a moment before, sang like plucked wires. The tech went out on deck and laid a hand on one. Beneath his fingers, he felt a slow, pulsing vibration. He thought of Port Mercy, though he had no reason to. He didn't know that story then. He thought instead of whales, of currents, of anything except the idea that something had briefly taken an interest in the long metal vein they had laid down into its world. It passed. The log of that night notes nothing but a minor altitude fluctuation on the tow and a brief interruption in data. Data is good at averaging out fear. Memory is not. So what, finally, do we do with the tail of the creature that dragged down 3 boats? Do we pin it onto a hook labeled Kraken and hang it with the rest of the sailors' yarns? Do we dismiss it as misremembered panic and old equipment, a string of bad decisions in a place that punishes such lapses without mercy? Or do we allow, just for a moment, that the men of Port Mercy may have brushed against something real, something vast and slow and entirely uninterested in whether their species believed in it or not? From the Outland Archives' point of view, the answer is less important than the pattern. Human beings are new on the sea. We have taken much from it in a very short time. Fish, whales, oil, roots. We have laid our cables across its floors and our nets across its slopes. We have sunk our waste into its basins and assumed, implicitly, that what lives there is either ours to use or too small and simple to matter. Every now and then, the sea reminds us that this is an assumption, not a law. Sometimes the reminder comes as a storm that should not have built that fast. Sometimes as a wave that appears out of calm water. Sometimes, as in 1904, as a line that pulls in the wrong direction. Down. Daniel Hargreaves never had a grave. Neither did Scanlon or Eli or the 2 Harriet May men. Their names are carved into a simple wooden board in the tiny church at Port Mercy. Their wives and children lit candles beneath those names until the church itself fell into disuse and the town thinned. People move away, fishing grounds shift, new industries rise and fall. The ocean remains. Today, if you were to drive the Newfoundland coast and try to find Port Mercy, you would struggle. The harbor has silted. The flakes have rotted. A few stone foundations cling to the hill, half reclaimed by scrub. Stand on that crumbling slope on a calm evening, though, and the scene is not so different from what Mary saw a century ago. Flat water, distant blows from passing whales, the long, unseen reach of the banks. If you listen carefully, you might hear the faint clink of rigging from a modern trawler over the horizon. Its captain will have GPS and radar and satellite weather. He will know to within meters where the bottom lies beneath his keel. He may not know the story of 3 dories in 1904. He doesn't need to. The sea remembers for both of them. For those of us who will never cast a line from the deck of a bank schooner, the Port Mercy file still carries a lesson. We like to think of ourselves as the ones who do the hooking. We drop our lines, literal and metaphorical, into the world and expect to pull up what we want: food, resources, answers. Occasionally, though, we feel the opposite. A strange pressure on the rope, a tug from somewhere we cannot see, an invitation or a warning or simply a reminder that there are other hands in the dark. When that happens, whether you are standing on a wharf or staring at a sonar screen, you have a choice. You can dismiss it. You can tell yourself it was nothing and carry on as before. Or you can do what Captain Hargreaves finally learned to do. You can cut the line. Let the deep keep its secrets. Hooks can be forged again, gear can be mended, pride can be swallowed. Lives do not return as easily as fish. This has been the Outland Archives. File 1904 NL03, the creature that dragged down 3 boats. Until next time, respect the depth. Listen to the silence. And if you ever feel a steady, vertical pull in a dead flat sea, remember Port Mercy. And think very carefully about which end of the line you want to be on.